very much for being here. Tell me, does this work? You can hear. Can you hear at the back? Well, you want to hear at the back. It is right at the back. You can leave at any time. But if you can't hear, we'd quite like to hear. Just wave, shout, stamp, and so forth. So as Jim says, I'll speak for a bit. It will be about how, in a very, very long publishing career, one arrives at where I've got to, which is, apart from Ode, it is with, I was thinking on the train this morning, maybe somewhere between 400 and 600 authors. So I'm going to forget most of them today and just speak about the ones who have some bearing on the subject that James has laid down. Now, those of you who are capable ferrets and have wandered for any reason through the internet and found things that I may have written or said before will be quite irritated because I'm going to say the same things again. Nothing much changes in publishing. Certain things change. When I started, the Second World War was slightly over, and that made a difference because there were then in publishing, very senior in publishing, people who made decisions in publishing, in the days that there were decisions made in publishing by publishers other than by, wait a minute, we'll pause here. How many marketing directors are there here? No marketing directors. One marketing director. You can put your hand proudly in there. Very, very good people, marketing people, can't do without them. But in the days when all the publishing decisions, most of the publishing decisions were made by publishers, many of them were made by people who came from Europe, were driven out of Germany, driven out of Czechoslovakia, Italy, and so on. Came not only here, but came to America, and there were collaborations between English, British, and American houses in those days, the kind of which we don't see today. For example, at the Harvill Press, where they published Dr. Zhivago and the Leopard, and in 1 year, Dr. Zhivago, the Leopard, and a book called Born Free, which outsold Dr. Zhivago and the Leopard twice over. Born Free was a book about leopards, lions, I think there was a leopard involved. Anyway, interesting, we'll come back to those three titles. The point is that at that time, by the way, the decision to publish Born Free was made by a Russian editor at Harvill, the HAR part of Harvill, Manya Harari, who was almost the only person in English publishing who could put up with the author of Born Free, who was an Austrian beast called Joy Adamson. Difficult lady, not much of a writer. And this fine Russian decided she could deal with the author on the one hand and the text in a form of English on the other, and made, as you know, a huge worldwide success of it. But those who could we remember? Warburg, Frederick Warburg, German, actually came before the war. Leopold Ullstein, who started the publishing house I worked for, which was called Barry and Jenkins, and was one of the early conglomerates in the sense that it gathered up a whole lot of tiny publishing houses. One not so tiny, which was called Herbert Jenkins, which published illustrated books of genius and all the works of P.G. Woodhouse, whose editor it was my vast privilege to be for the last, I think, 6 or 7 books he wrote. Lovely human being. Anyway, Leopold Ullstein, Andre Deutsch, Ernest Hecht, George Weidenfeld, those names you all know, those lists you remember, they've gone. And although George Weidenfeld goes on, he's not active in Weidenfeld and Nicholson now, and its text still is at the Souvenir Press. But the days in which it was held utterly normal for publishers to translate from not just French and Italian and German, but all the languages in the world, those days are past. For those of you who are involved in translation, and I would like to know, how many are we talking about who are here, who are involved in translating literature? Too few. Still too few. My beloved wife in the second row, vastly involved. She could put her hand up. 3, still not enough. 4. The assumption that something written in Czech or Slovakian could be as interesting to an English reader, assuming there is such a thing, has gone. So you, as you know, you have to fight your way past the marketing director on the one hand. And why do you have to fight your way past the marketing director? I'll give you a single example. When Stieg Larsson's rather successful trilogy was presented to publishing houses here, he was turned down by 8 of them, and in America by either 7 or 8, I'm not sure. Nobody's putting their hands up and saying, I turned down Stieg Larsson in America. But what we do know is that marketing directors in America said to the editors who may have said, look, this is unprogrammable, wonderful narrative stuff. Well, it may be, but certain orthodoxies apply. 1, he's Swedish. 2, he's dead. 3, he can't do an autograph. 4, he can't write another book. Therefore, we're not going to invest any part of our budget. Now, these orthodoxies must be shivering somewhere on their foundations, because it turns out it did rather well here. It did equally well in America, where finally, having turned it down twice already, an American publisher said he would actually read it, and then of course bought it, as Anon did several other people tried to do. Bought it, published it extremely well, not because the author was dead, but because they thought the books were even rather good. Now, we had come to whether there is a future for translation on the one hand, Swedish crime novels on the other. But what we should just look at is how, and I arrived by the way at a publishing house which published John Moe, one of the founders of the Arvin Foundation, and a great poet, and hitherto a considerable novelist. This was in the late 60s. And The Tuban and the Two, not a very successful book, but was absolutely wonderful. And a reviewer said this is like Chekhov, and that was enough. We both went on very happily after that. So we'll move on. There are on the screen 30 plus images. And
before you do, can everyone hear above the cacophony? Are you okay with that?
How is it?
Is it possible to turn it up a little bit?
Can't get much closer to the microphone.
I could move it.
If you could get closer to the microphone, we can put it here. That's fine. Is that even better? Primitive shapes of the back. In the house that published, which was then called, I went to a house called MacLehose Press, from a job which I had for 3 very happy years as the literary editor of Scotland, in which time it seemed then, we're talking about 64, 65, 66, perfectly normal to review books published in French, German, and Italian, which we did, and even had huge page-and-a-half articles on the Japanese post-war novel, the Italian post-war novel, and so on. And this went all the way around Europe, until the point at which the editor stopped me in the passage one day and he said, MacLehose, small thing, he said, if I read in my newspaper more than half a page on the North Vietnamese novel, you're fired. And I thought that was a highly reasonable limit to define. And it tells you how long ago that was. This was in the middle of the war. If it said the South Vietnamese novel, it might have been a very different matter. Anyway, at the Crescent Press, there was Margarita Lasky, who's the wife of the publisher, John Howard. We had a completely, everybody accepted in those days, translation. But apart from P.G. Woodhouse, there came to that publishing house. Did any of you ever read the Flashman series? No woman need apply. But I mean, a lot of men read Flashman in those days. And this was one of them. And by the way, it has a bearing, this humble image, on something about the making of a brand or an identity, both of a publishing house and obviously more importantly of an author. That if you have the chance to have an art director who was also the production director, who found Arthur Barbosa, the artist of the original George Fraser jackets, and every single person in the publishing house who was willing to say, this is going to be completely wonderful. I would say, even the accountant, but we didn't have an accountant in that publishing house. Are there any accountants here? This is puzzling. I always say to editors, if they're going to meetings with publishers, take the accountant, because why? Give him some idea, even her, what it is you do. Because you won't tell him yourself, so you can get somebody else to do it for you. But anyway, no accountant. It worked because even from the very beginning, this was narrative genius. And you fitted the work of George MacDonald Fraser into everything else that you did. Anon, I left the Crescent Press and P.G. Woodhouse, Herbert Jenkins, Barry and Jenkins, and so on. And went to Chatham, where we published, I mean, everybody knows what is Chatham. It's changed very, very little. And very curiously, had in those days only one translated writer, a chap called Proust. Good as he was, amazing that he was the only one. You'd think with all the success you had publishing Proust, you could do something more interesting than republish Proust in a new translation. That was the only, almost the only translation that was done in my years there. We published also beloved Toni Morrison, and one of the questions that Joe asked is, how does an imprint develop its character? And obviously if you're Chatham and you're 100 years old, you are not reshaping what is already there. We once published a young American writer called Laurie Coleman, who came from America, and she said very gracious things to Nora Smallwood, who was running the firm. And Nora said to Laurie, you must be very proud to be published by Chatham. She said, not in the least, I'm just here for the money. And that was nice, because that's the other side of the business. Other writers, among them Christopher Isherwood, you remember that Chatham acquired and looked after the whole list of the Hogarth Press, of whom Christopher Isherwood in the early days was a crucial part. Went away very suddenly, inexplicably vanished. And years later, I was offered the chance at Chatham to publish his, I think then the last two books of his life. And I was curious, why had he gone? So I rang him up, he was in California, and asked him, why had you abandoned the Hogarth Press, which was surely the most interesting press altogether then in England? And he said, do you know why? He said, very soft, gentle American accent, he said, I was so sick of it, Virginia stopped asking me to tea. I thought, what a whim. So we'll not publish Christopher Ashwood if that's a reason for leaving a publishing house. But he was very jealous. I don't know who it was who was asked to be, but if you have a list, that list is also what Harvill told us once when he came to Harvill. He sat down at the table we had then, at which everybody in the house could also sit. There he was. He said, "This is the publishing house where you all sit down together. We talk about books, we talk about my poetry, and this is us." And I often thought that if you're thinking, who would you take on? Who would you take back? Would you take Christopher Isherwood back? Or would he be whimpering at the edge of the table all the time? Do they sit down comfortably together? Do they share in their work and their nature some essential identity? And I've often thought of that. Would you add, I'm not going to think of a writer that one would not add to one's table, but there are several. It's a useful way of saying, yes, we will take a shape of a list which includes, you haven't read them all, you haven't met them all, but let's say all the Russians that the Harvill Press earliest in their years had. They would all be at home at that one table. We'll go from Chatto, where Toni Morrison, by the way, Toni Morrison, how did Toni Morrison come to Chatto? Rather well published by Penguin, and then for some reason offered to be at Chatto, and because I've always done this, I said to the editor-in-chief at the time, I said, "We've been offered the work of Toni Morrison. Would you mind very much if we made an offer for her new book, which was Song of Solomon?" Toni Morrison, he said, "Hold on a minute, that black writer?" I said, "Yes." "No, you can have it," he said. "Not useful to us." Fine. So one added Toni Morrison, and I'm happy to say that she's still there, to the Chatto list. People come in strange ways. You can't always achieve precisely what you think would be the perfect shape of your list. You can't necessarily, if you wanted to, add Ian McEwan to it. You have to wait until the Ian McEwans of this world present themselves at a price that you can afford. The Harvill list was, this is famously true, built by the Russian Mania Haradi with her English friend Marjorie Villiers, the V-I-L-L of Harvill. And after a little time at Collins, where I went to after I left Chatto, leaving behind The Snow Leopard by Peter Matheson, but who obviously came back in the end, came back to Harvill, where I think most of his books were in print, and now will start again the MacLehose Press. I went to Collins and was lucky enough there, Collins being at that time not only the publisher of Rose Macaulay and many very considerable writers, but also of the whole Harvill Press which they had acquired, along with the Leopard, along with Elsa, and along with Dr. Zhivago. And then one day, in one of these very regular, they take place almost, I think, every 4.5 years now by rote, total reorganization of a conglomerate. So one of the things they decided to do was to hive off the Harvill Press. And because I had evidenced a habit to take on writers in translation, I was thrown out of Collins and told to go and run the Harvill Press and try and keep all of these foreigners in a separate corner. And in addition to to the foreigners in the separate corner. Communists incredibly said, we don't want any more of our Russians on our paperback list. We don't want any foreigners at all if we can avoid them. So you can take all the Italians and other people you like. And in a single fell swoop, the Harvill Press, with its own trade paperback list, acquired the entire Russian backlist and the leopard. And we made a logo of the leopard. This is too small to see. But that little tiny leopard began to stand for something. And it was made up of Elsa's leopards on the one hand, Lampedusa's leopard on the other, and a leopard that I was particularly fond of, which was one of the ships of Captain Aubrey, what was he called? Captain Aubrey, who has read Patrick O'Brien's sea novels? Well done. Absolutely magnificent. By the way, anybody who hasn't read the Jane Austen of the 20th century is missing something. The difficulty with Patrick O'Brien is that there are, as you know by now, 19 novels, and if you have to start at the beginning, you must start at the beginning. You have to cut out a small part of your future life. Well worth doing. Brilliant novel. So there is the three-part leopard. So we began with our eponymous leopard, to build a list of writers in translation, as well as English writers, and writers who, if you like, conform to one idea of what it was that you wanted your publishing house to be. What would work, what would fit, what would be your sense of a perfect shape. And you could remember that, or you could bear in mind, that at that moment, and I can't remember which year it was, my wife was, it was the year before we married. What are we doing about 1985, 6, something like that. There were only 2 writers left alive on the Harvill list, of whom Solzhenitsyn was one, and the Chinese lady, now forgotten, was the other. Yasha Kamal was also still alive. So we set out to rebuild a list of writers in translation. And partly because it's Manchester, and partly because in I think it was 1946, people quarreled with this. Somebody here must know better. When did Matt Busby come to Manchester United? Well, if I say 46, you wouldn't argue with me after. We called it 1946. I was quite small and needed a football team. And so I settled for Manchester United because Matt Busby was Scottish. And somebody said to him years later, Mr. Busby, how is it that your teams always seem to have this impeccable shape? How do you do the shape of your football teams? And he said, somebody told me once that a chap called Rodin was asked the same question about his sculpture. And the answer was this: you get an enormous piece of marble, huge piece of marble, and you're going to make the sculpture of an elephant. So what you do is you look at it for a long time and you knock off this piece of marble everything that doesn't look like an elephant. And I like that because it tells you in publishing terms something crucially important, which is that you don't publish, you knock off the bits that don't belong on your elephant. Now, everybody has a publishing house in their mind, which conforms to their notion of what is, that's where I feel at home. I had an aunt, a very great aunt, once, whose every book in her house was bound in the rather lovely pale blue cloth binder that Nelson, the publisher, used to use between the wars. And I said, why are all your books published by Nelson? And she said, I feel safe with Nelson books. She said, I'm not going to be shocked by anything they publish. And I thought, well, that's sweet. That's one idea of an elephant. You have a pale blue book. It doesn't matter what's in them. You feel cozy with them, the colour, the size and so on. They were all large crown editions, and they were a very nice thing to live with. Whether the insides of those books conform to Matt Busby's Elephant or not.
1945.
1945.
1945.
I was younger than I thought. How very interesting. Good. Well, I could have taken a year to get used to the idea. Thank you for this update. Anyway, there we are, lodged in Matt Busby's Manchester. I've been a firm supporter ever since. You can imagine how happy I